Welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with Deirdre McCloskey, an economist and historian, professor emerita at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Welcome, Deirdre. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Deirdre, you've just come out with the third book in your trilogy, The Bourgeois Era, which expresses your perspective on growth, economic growth and development in Europe and the Western world. And you raise some very interesting points in this book that I'd love to be able to explore a little bit. One of my first reactions, thinking about some of your ideas, was to think back on something I had read by Milan Kundera, where he talks about the early 1900s, and he talks about how the intellectuals, the artists, the intelligentsia was so much in favor of the idea of communism. And it was really the merchant class, the dry cleaners, the tailors, who were terrified of the concept. And it took several years for the intelligentsia to come to terms with the fact that perhaps they had been wrong. And it was the merchant class who really saw something that they were unable to see and to predict.
I'm not sure the clerisy, as I call them, these artists, intellectuals, journalists, and so forth, have ever quite come to terms with what we unfortunately call capitalism. In fact, it's in the late 19th century that the clerisy changes, because in the 1700s and even into the early 19th century, there are many members of this intellectual scribbling class who approve of the bourgeoisie, the merchants, and think that they're the edge of progress. But then there's this very strange great conversion, as George Bernard Shaw called it, after 1848. And you get the rise of socialist ideas, which can go either to the right or the left, either to fascism or communism. And it's a puzzle why it happened, but it happened, and we're still not quite recovered from it.
We recovered from it enough in Europe, perhaps, that we seem to have seen huge strides in terms of economic development.
Well, absolutely. In practical terms, now we're speaking of opinion, but in practical terms, this earlier pro-bourgeois branch of the intelligentsia fades, but ordinary people approve of getting richer. And what I call the bourgeois deal gradually comes to be embraced by ordinary people and by politics. The bourgeois deal is, you let me make a profit by innovating, and in the long run I'll make you rich. Not so bad. It's happening now in India and China.
That's right. But it does bring to mind, if you remember Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel.
I know it very well.
He has someone from Papua New Guinea ask him the question, why is it that the West has developed so rapidly and we are still so poor?
He said, why do you white people have so much cargo? And he included the Japanese in white people. From his perspective. And Jared has a very plausible explanation for why this more cargo eventually had to happen somewhere in Eurasia, somewhere from Japan to Ireland, somewhere in there. But his explanation of why, then he thinks he has an explanation of why it happened in Europe, and he doesn't. My own explanation, he hasn't really got an explanation for why it happened at that end of Eurasia at first and then spread to the rest. And my own explanation is liberalism, is the idea that's unique to Holland in the 17th century, in England and Scotland and the English offshoots in the 18th and 19th century, that in the first place, everyone should be allowed to have a go, so that's liberty, and that they should be honored for it. And I call that I call that dignity. So liberty and dignity, those ideas, very unusual ones, became the engine that made the whole society become innovative. And it's innovation. It's not capital accumulation or violence or imperialism or whatever. That's not it. It's ideas.
I'm reminded of James Carville's slogan for the Clinton election, where he says, "It's the economy, stupid." And I read your books, and I very much get this idea that you're saying it's the ideas, stupid.
Right. That's very good. I'm gonna steal that.
You're welcome to it, but it does make me think a little bit. We were talking earlier about Piketty's book and
Yes.
his take on why we're seeing the kind of inequality that we're seeing today. And if it really is ideas, why is it that we're seeing this kind of discrepancy across the countries, poor countries and rich countries today, and also within countries?
Well, I think the answer is we're not. In his book, he admits that the only places where there has been a notable increase in inequality are Britain, the United States, and Canada. And then he kind of drops Canada. The main theme of his book is that it's going to get worse, not that it has gotten worse. And as for the international discrepancies, they're collapsing at a great rate. We're in the throes of a great convergence. And again, I speak of China and India, 38% of the world population. China in 1978 adopted Adam Smith. Not quite. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's roughly what they did. And then in 1991, India, alarmed by the success of China, did the same thing. And the result was growth rates from 7 to 10% a year, which solves a lot of social problems. And it will eventually result in a couple of generations in the utter transformation of India and China. I just hope that countries that I know and love well, like South Africa, where I've taught, or Brazil, where I've been a number of times, I hope they'll see that they should adopt the same policies.
You know, it's this very optimistic view of the world that says we're going to start breaking down some of these barriers, we'll start dealing with poverty. But if we look long term, are there concerns we need to have in terms of resource constraints? Because if I think about the lifestyle we're leading here, if I imagine everyone in China and India trying to imitate an American lifestyle or a Northern European lifestyle, I can't imagine what's going to happen to our environment.
We better get used to it, because that's what's going to happen, whether we like it or not, thank God. And I think that the same ingenuity that I'm talking about, this liberal idea that of dignity and liberty will make for tremendous ingenuity, which will solve some of these in these environmental problems. I think we're on the way to solving them.
Nassim Taleb has a famous comment that the turkey always thinks that the farmer is his best friend until the evening before Thanksgiving.
That's true.
So how do we know that just because that's the way it's been so far, isn't it possible that this may be just 100 years of an accident that allowed us to see this incredible growth? How do we know that we're going to be able to?
That would be plausible if there was no deep sociological and political reason why we're so innovative. But there is a good reason. When you allow people to open a convenience store freely, and to start a new factory freely, and to invent this or that, and you honor them in doing it, it happens. And it's happened on such a scale. Here's the key point. In 1800, the average income of the world in modern dollars per capita was about $3 a day. Now, even including very poor countries, it's $33 a day. $33 a day is the average. Think of Brazil, which is about at the world average. And in places like Japan or South Korea on one hand, or France and Sweden on the other, it's gone up to about $100 a day. Mm-hmm. That's a factor of 33. And that's an immense increase. And in fact, in some ways, the environment has improved. I mean, air pollution in Beijing is terrible. But Chicago in 1910 was worse, much worse. And yet, we cleaned up the air. I can remember first time I went to Britain in 1959 as a kid. I was in a fog where you couldn't see your feet. Now, no longer.
Right. We have the Kuznets curve for the environment.
Exactly.
And it's true we have seen improvements, but my question is not so much about the limits to our innovation, but perhaps the limits to the science. We have developed ways to produce more and more energy to feed our needs, but we're now starting to come up against our limits of storing our waste.
Yes. Now, yes and no. I mean, for some reason, which I don't know, I'd like you to explain it to me, people love pessimistic stories. My friend Bob Gordon just wrote a big, thick book saying how the world, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And you may remember Ehrlich back in 1968. Paul Ehrlich,
the population
made something like the worst scientific prediction in the 20th century. India is now a food exporter, for example, and he said, "Oh no, it's the race is over. We're all," you know. And yet people continue to put Ehrlich on TV, and he tells the race is over. We're all going to die. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. And it hasn't happened yet. Mm-hmm. We had an ozone hole expanding over Antarctica, caused partly by hairspray. Hairspray. Margaret Thatcher, a serious user of hairspray, got out ahead of this, and she and lots of other politicians decided to do something about it. We did. Fluorocarbons were banned, and so we can do it. Of course, it could go to hell. It could. But so many people have said this. At the end of the war, the Second War, most economists thought we were going to go back to the condition of the Great Depression. Stagnationism was the conventional economics. It didn't happen. So I urge you, dear, be of good cheer.
Be more optimistic.
Be more optimistic, because you could say there's dangers in excessive optimism. I can see your point, but there's also dangers in pessimism. Mm-hmm. That, for example, let's be concrete. The pessimism about population growth, which was rampant in the 1950s and especially the 1960s, resulted in China in the one-child policy, mm-hmm. and in India in compulsory sterilization on a big scale. And this was an exceptionally silly anxiety. And it caused, actually these ideas about sterilization and population control, violent population control, were not Chinese or South Asian.
Yeah.
They were European. The big country, the countries with the worst record on compulsory eugenic sterilization are Sweden and Norway from the 1930s on. So pessimism is not only bad for your health and makes for high blood pressure and so on, it's often scientifically wrong, and in any case dangerous in politics.
C.P. Snow makes the point that at some point there was a split between scientific intellectuals and
Yeah.
literary intellectuals.
Yeah.
And I wonder in some ways if this can be adapted to where we are, where I see you making a distinction between the intelligentsia and the bourgeoisie. And I feel in some ways that you are such a beautiful representative of the intelligentsia, building a bridge over to a different way of viewing the world. And
I've been
I
trying
thank
to
you
do
for
that for many years. As a, young person, I was a positivist and a quantitative economic historian and mathematical economist, scornful of the professors of English and so on. And now I'm an emerita professor of English. And I came by that in a complicated way, but the basic point is that we'll make more progress if we walk on both legs. If we attempt to hop along on our humanistic leg or our scientific leg, quantitative leg alone, we're not going to make as much progress. And in fact, I would argue that there's a humanistic step in every scientific argument. The humanities are about categories. The simplest one is good and bad. Is the novel good or bad? But then you move to philosophy and the ethics of good and bad, but it's much more than that. What's a human? What's a non-human? What's a man? What's a woman? What's a courageous person? What's a coward? Those are all the deep categorical questions in the humanities, in which, by the way, I include mathematics. Mathematics is about quality, about on-off existence, non-existence, as is theology and myth and so forth. Those are the humanities. If we don't know what the thing is we're counting, we can't count it. So there's a necessary humanistic step in every quantitative scientific inquiry. And I'm afraid the most quantitative scientists have no idea that this is the case. The more sophisticated ones do.
Wonderful words for economists to live by.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
dear.
joining us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.